If you mention to people that you have an amp that's running over 1,000 watts, they might look at you a little wide-eyed, wondering how you're not suffering major hearing loss. Then that creates a question of, do you really need that much power? In this video, I'm going to discuss why the answer can be yes, and it doesn't have to mean that you want a crazy system that sounds obnoxious. When I have talked to people before about having big amps with a lot of power, they often think of the cars that drive by down the street with the booming stereos that people can hear, from half a mile away. And while those systems do often involve multi-thousand watt systems, there's a difference between listening to really bassy music and running it at a very high level the whole time, or you're watching, say, movies, and you just want to make sure that explosions and other sound effects are impactful and realistic. And I'll break down why this comes into play more than you might think. For the rest of what I'm going to say to make sense, we have to talk about decibels as a sound measurement real quick. So 1 decibel is basically, as I understand it, the smallest variation in volume level that our human ears can detect, and that's the measurement of that amount. For every 3 decibel increase in a sound signal, it requires 2 times the amplification power from an amp in order to play that difference. It only accounts for about a 25% difference in loudness to our ears. So you could see where that can escalate quickly, because every time we're even turning the volume to our ears up about 25%, we're doubling the power demands that it has on the amp. Now, a lot of the times we don't feel it on a home receiver or whatever we're doing, because maybe the RMS, the average power that we're using for what we're listening to, is only like 3 watts. So doubling that, going to 6, you don't even feel that. But peaks that you see sometimes in albums with a lot of dynamic range, which is a lot of difference between the quietest and the very loudest notes, or in movies where like the difference of volume of speech and some sound effects versus somebody crashes through a window or something like that. The sound of the crashing through the window might be a whole 10 decibels louder than everything else that was going on. Well, 10 decibels is almost 10 times the power demand of all of the other sound effects that were going on. So say you were already listening at a level that to play the general stuff that was going on in that scene was requiring about 20 watts from your amp, that crashing through the window is going to require 200 watts. Well, that's something that the power ratings of a lot of standard home receivers per channel, about 100 watts, would be struggling to do. When you're asking more of your amp than it can give, one of 2 things usually happens. The first is clipping. Clipping, you've probably heard people talk about before. It's dangerous because it can ruin your speakers. When an amp clips, it basically is trying to do the up and down of the waves, and since it can't hit those peaks, it ends up squaring them off, below where the actual peak would have been. Now, because the speaker moves back and forth in conjunction with the up and down of the waves, anytime it's squared means that when it moves forward, now to us it's milliseconds, but to the speaker it's a lot. It's moving forward and pausing there, and then having to move back. That puts strain on the magnet and the voice coil to keep it suspended there, and because there's continuous power running through the voice coil to hold it in each position, it's not getting the cooling that it needs. The benefit for a speaker is the rapid motion swishing the air around in the box that it's in actually helps keep the voice coil cool, and when it has to pause like that, it can cause a lot of heat to build up very quickly, and you can burn out your speakers doing it, which is one of the big reasons why people always are saying avoid clipping your amp. The other thing that can happen is compression. Some amps, in order to try to avoid clipping, will compress the sound signal, meaning if the amp says, I only have 100 watts to give, you're asking for 200. I'm just going to play it at 100 and do the best I can. Well, now you might not experience clipping per se, but the dynamic, the difference between the average sound effects going on that maybe was supposed to be this much will only be this much, because this is the volume level of everything else going on, and now this is as high as it can play that. That can end up making everything you're hearing sound dull and flat. Or if you've ever been listening to an action movie or even an album and thought none of the percussion or the instruments really have any sense of impact, or that guy just bashed through a wall, or there was just an explosion and it felt really like A lot of times that's the reason. The amp just doesn't have enough power to really hit that peak that is in the audio signal, and so it's underwhelming to listen to. Another thing to bear in mind is that while you see the terms RMS power and peak power used in both speakers and amps, most audio enthusiasts agree it's really only valid to talk about peak power for speakers. RMS power might mean this is how much the manufacturer says in terms of power this speaker can safely handle on a continuous basis, i.e., if you're listening to a song, the average volume level of that song that you're just going to leave it at for the entire song, that would be your RMS maximum. The peak power would be like one loud sound effect that happens real quick and stops, and it's not constant. The speaker might be able to handle 2 to 3 times what its RMS rating is for that brief moment without there being an issue, as long as you're not overheating the voice coil, and as long as you're not asking the speaker to move so far back and forth that it's actually damaging the voice coil or bottoming the cone out. You can do that if you hit really low frequencies. It's a lot easier, say, on a subwoofer to overdrive it if you're playing at 80 hertz versus 20 hertz. The 80 hertz is going to be really fast. The 20 hertz is going to be really long and really slow, and overdriving 20 hertz if the speaker is not built for that kind of movement can cause issues. However, an amp, like we talked about, can't really honestly go above its RMS rating, or else you get the clipping. And most amps will audibly start distorting when they reach about 80% of their total RMS rating, which means if you even get them close to their maximum, you're going to start hearing distortion in the sound. So you can then see why you would want to kind of buy too much amp for the job in a way. Say you have a subwoofer that's capable of 1,000-watt peaks. Okay, then you might want a 1,000-watt RMS amp, and that way you would go into it knowing the loudest sounds I'm ever going to hear, the amp will always have enough power to play them properly with no distortion and no compression, and it has enough power in itself to do the biggest peaks that this subwoofer can handle, and everybody's going to be happy. And because of that rule where at the 80% mark you start getting distortion, that is also why some people overdrive their speakers. So you might say, I'm going to buy a 1,500-watt amp for a 1,000-watt speaker. Now, a lot of people bristle at that because they're like, oh, you're going to blow up your speaker. That would only ever happen if you turned your amp up all the way, which no one does. And so really what happens is you're saying, I have so much power in this case that I can fully drive this speaker to the biggest peaks that the speaker will ever handle. It'll do it cleanly, and I'll never even have to hit that 80% mark where I start getting distortion because I have more power than I would ever use, and I'm good. People make the mistake of assuming that, say, having 1,000 watts means playing at some absurdly high level all the time, when what it really just means is having the headroom to play occasional really loud parts properly. Let's return to that thought about doubling of power every 3 decibels. Say you're already at a point with your subwoofer where explosions and big loud bassy scenes are playing at about 250 watts. Well, if you were saying, I want it a little bit louder than it is, not like super louder, but a bit, well, that 25% increase is now bringing you to 500 watts of power requirement. And if you wanted 50% more power than you currently have, that's going to take you all the way up to that 1,000-watt level just from 250 watts. So see, this is where it can get a little misleading, because you would look at the difference between, say, 250 watts and 1,000 and think, that's 4 times the power. That must be a crazy amount louder. Not really. It's only 50% louder. If it's like a comfortable volume versus like a cinematic volume that you want it to be very intense, not like ear-hurting intense, but exciting intense, a 50% increase in volume is actually pretty conservative. It's pretty typical, and so you could hit that level very quickly. And because it keeps doubling, if you were a person who had, say, a very large living room, or you have a basement or something like that where you have a very large space to fill, if you're already playing at a 500 to 1,000 watt level, to go any further, you can start seeing where you need a hell of a lot of power to keep going any further. And the difference becomes more drastic again than it seems. Going from 1,000 watts to 2,000 watts again feels like, wow, that's a giant increase in power, and it would only once again account for 25% more volume. I found that very much myself at one point while I was using an Infinity subwoofer in my living room, and I was driving it with I think it was a 300 watt amp. Well, when I put an amp that had 700 watts of power onto it, now mind you, this speaker was 350 watt RMS. Now it could handle a lot more peak. So there was the going into that zone again where people would be like, oh no, you're plugging a 700 watt amp into a 350 watt RMS speaker, you're going to overdrive it. I didn't, because it could handle the peaks. And what I found that it made a difference in the sound was every time I hit those peaks, explosions, crashing glass, or even percussion hits, things like that in music just felt way more sharp and punchy. And like, if you ever wanted that like bass that you can feel hit you in the chest a little bit, I got way more of that feeling of that from the same subwoofer just by driving it with that kind of power. And that again made it clear to me that what was happening on the other amp was it just didn't have enough power for those peaks, and so everything just kind of fell flat. There's a difference between loudness and impact. You might have enough amp power to reach a loudness that more or less seems right for the way you want to listen to music or watch movies, but without the ability to hit those peaks is really going to make a difference in the impact. And it requires a lot of power, even if just for brief moments in what you're listening to do that. So without belaboring the point and going on and on, hopefully that helps you to understand why, if somebody tells you that they have an amp that is that big, why that's necessary, why it's not as crazy as it might seem. Even if, say, you've been using a home theater system with a subwoofer that's maybe 200 watts or something, and you thought it sounded pretty good, but you're looking for a way to really like crank up the realism of your movies, that can be something right there. Now, I don't recommend just arbitrarily going out and buying a crazy amplifier and trying to overdrive a subwoofer that wasn't built for it. You may have to really rebuild parts of your system. But if you are doing it separately, a lot of times you buy the subwoofers that have their own plate amp on the back of them, and then you don't really have any control over, other than buying a different model, you don't have any control over what power you're using. If you're like me and you buy your own speaker cones sometimes and you build your own boxes for them, and then you buy a separate amp, then you have a lot of control over how much amp you're doing for the job. Right now in my living room, I'm using a Dayton Audio Ultimax 15 subwoofer. It's capable of 800 watts RMS, 1600 watt peak, and I'm driving it with a Crown XLS 1002. It can do about 1100 watts RMS the way that I have it configured currently. So it's not quite delivering the peak power of the sub, but it is overdriving the RMS power of the sub, and that's plenty for my own needs. And going that route has made a huge difference in music and movies for me versus anything that I had used before that. Put questions down below if I didn't talk about something, or if you want me to go into more detail, maybe I can do a follow-up video. But this is something I was thinking about this week and just thought it would be a cool video topic to throw out here. And if you found this useful, please hit the like button or subscribe to my channel. It really helps me to be able to keep reaching new people and putting my content out there. And the more my channel grows, the more excited I am to keep doing this kind of content. So thanks again. Catch you in the next one.